Morning, everybody. This is our third and final video on Congress, and for this particular video, what I wanted to take a look at is how a bill becomes a law and how different congressional behaviors can affect those bills to become laws and eventual policies. So first, let's go ahead and explore what is a bill. Understand that a bill first starts as an idea, and that can come from any of us, but recognize only that Congress members themselves can actually propose those laws on the floor. But as it mentions here, it can come from us, the governor, executive agencies, interest groups, legislators themselves. Groups like the ACLU or the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Rifle Association, the Environmental Protection, the Sierra Club, as well as a variety of other groups propose bills all the time. But recognize that those interest groups are part of us. Now, it's important to note the steps that a law takes before it becomes a law. So, as we mentioned, it starts as an idea, and then the bill is introduced into Congress. Again, it has to be sponsored by a particular Congress member, though, in order for it to enter Congress. If they choose not to do it, well, then it won't happen. And that's when you have something like the initiative system that we have here in California. But that is for another discussion. So the bill gets introduced, and at that point, House leadership or Senate leadership assigns that to a particular committee. And we looked at committees in earlier videos there. So it could go to an agricultural committee or the foreign affairs committee. After it goes to the committee and they determine that it needs to pass, then it can go for a full floor debate. Recognize that most bills die when they go to committee. In fact, some don't even make it that far. Some don't even get assigned to committees. If the House or Senate leadership decides to table the bill and save it for much later in the year, they absolutely have the ability to do that. But if it does go through committee, then it does get through committee. It goes for a full debate in the House. But remember that the bill has to pass in both the House and the Senate. So if they have different versions of the bill, that's when the conference committee comes into play and they iron out those differences. And that's when it comes to presidential action. Again, it'll either be a veto or he'll pass the bill. But what factors go into influencing Congress? What do they look at in making those determinations? Well, they look at their party, and anymore, that's one of the largest factors, their constituents, which represent you and I, the people that they represent. The administration, meaning the president and his entire executive branch, pressure groups, interest groups like we mentioned, colleagues and staff, meaning their fellow Congress members, as well as the staff that they have that are helping them understand the bills and influencing them. Remember, a lot of the congressional staff are the ones that are writing their positions. Obviously, they're hired based on those views, but it is important to note that much of what those Congress members actually speak out there on the floor were written by staff members there, not themselves. And finally, personal beliefs. All these play a large part, but it totally depends upon the Congress member of which of these play the largest part. But part of these factors there that are influenced by all of these are who's in Congress. So I think it's important to note that of the current Congress, the 116th, how many are women? How many are white? How many are black? How many are Hispanic? Some folks argue that this doesn't matter, but a number of Americans would absolutely disagree with that. They have a different set of interests in mind in some cases, and it's important to note whether or not those can impact their views of all of these factors. After all, if I am an African American from a largely African American district, that's going to have a particular impact on how I vote on particular bills. Or if I don't get that representation as a minority, and largely it's white males that are largely getting elected, that might lead to a different set of priorities for those Congress members. What I think is especially interesting as well is looking at some of the trends of women in Congress. If you'll notice that the number of women in Congress right up until the late 1980s was below 5% or roughly 5%. It isn't until the late 80s and early 90s where you see a sharp uptick there. What else here, you notice that the amount of Republican women has kind of shifted up and down over time, but you've seen a pretty marked shift downward here. And the number of women has spiked quite a bit in Congress. We're nowhere near 50%, but you can see this 36, 37% is a whole heck of a lot closer to actual representation that we have in the rest of the country. Something that we looked at earlier on this unit was the roles that Congress members can play: delegate, trustee, partisan, and politico. Um, Recognize that delegate has largely of late, especially with the impact of gerrymandering, been tied largely to partisanship. In other words, if they really want to represent their constituents, especially in a largely gerrymandered district, that will largely be tied to party. Whereas some folks want to stand on their own principles and beliefs. And that does typically mean that they're standing apart from their party and sometimes apart from their constituents. And that can cost them dearly, or it can grant them some quite a bit of integrity points. It depends upon the will of the nation and how well that kind of stands, what the issue is that they're standing up for. A politico is a role that we haven't looked at, but that's something that balances, that's a role where they're balancing different aspects of each of these three. How good a job are they doing balancing those different roles? Well, if you look at approval ratings, it looks like they're doing just a horrible job. You can see upwards of the late 2010s here, they're looking at an 83 disapproval rate and a 13% approval rate. I've heard numbers as low this past year of the single digits. So single digit approval rate for Congress. But it's important to kind of compare that with what these numbers look like. Check this out. Incumbency, if you'll recall, is the chances of getting reelected into the same position again, right? So if I'm a House member here, my chances of getting reelected are at roughly 96%. My chances of getting reelected in the Senate here in 2016 were roughly 93%. So how is it that approval rating is so unbelievably low, but they keep getting reelected? Well, it's important to note the role that they play here. Remember, Congress members are getting elected from specific districts here. And if these districts are drawn in such a way to heavily favor one political party over another, okay, that's going to lead to more and more partisanship and more polarization within the political party system and within those voters. So, for instance, I like my particular Congress member a whole heck of a lot, which is why I keep reelecting him. But I might hate the guy in the district right next to me, this one right here. In addition to that, incumbents, or the people that are already in power, have enormous amounts of advantages. And I'll let you take a look at these here on your own time. One of the key problems with incumbency, though, because Congress members can serve up to decades. Now, granted, a representative only serves 2-year terms, right? Senators serve 6-year terms, but there's no limit on the amount of times that they can get reelected. Dianne Feinstein, for instance, is in her 80s right now. She continues to be reelected, and she was first elected in 1992. For these reasons, some have proposed term limits for Congress. That would likely require a constitutional amendment to the Constitution. In fact, it would absolutely require a constitutional amendment. There are some pros and cons for this. I'll let you determine whether or not you think one side is better than the other, but it would prevent people from serving nearly as long as they are. But until such a thing passes, it comes down to the elections themselves. This is a map of the Senate race ratings here, and the number of those safely Democratic or safely Republican, and those that might be up for grabs. This will play those folks that are in likely Democrat or likely Republican or lean Republican are going to have a harder time going hard one direction or the other. If they go towards the Democratic side, trying to reach out to those independent or Democratic voters, they might lose that Republican base. And likewise, if I'm a Democrat and I reach out to them, that might alienate those voters there. So when we're looking at how different Congress members weigh making decisions on what bills to pass, these factors have a lot to do with it. Thanks for the time, everybody, and I hope you found this informative. Bye-bye.